The First Real Eyes, Part 1. The Voice in the Window. NASA called his name 4 times before he answered. Linkvist, Tema, we need your eyes on the docking telemetry. The port side alignment sensor is throwing a variance, and we want a manual confirm before we hand off to auto approach. Tema Linkvist heard every word. He processed the meaning of them. He understood that somewhere in Houston, a room full of people were watching their screens, waiting, and that his job in this moment was to turn from the window, pull up the telemetry display, and give them a number. He did not turn from the window. Tema, a different voice now. Hargrove, the flight director, the one who never raised his pitch, but somehow made his patience feel like a physical weight. We see your vitals are nominal. We need a verbal confirm. One moment, Tema said. His voice came out quieter than he intended, barely above a murmur. The way voices go when the brain is fully occupied elsewhere and only a small background process is available to handle speech. Outside the curved viewpoint of the Vega, Tesla Aerospace's third crewed deep space vessel, Mars, filled the lower third of his visible universe. He had seen photographs. Of course, he had seen photographs. He had spent 4 years in the program looking at photographs, at renders, at simulation walkthroughs, and topographic overlays and infrared composites. He had a working familiarity with every quadrant of the Hellas Basin and could identify Olympus Mons from its shadow profile alone. He thought he knew what it would look like. He had been wrong in a way that photographs will always make you wrong about something real. It was the color first, not red exactly. That word was too simple, too flat for what he was seeing. It was red the way a sunset is red, which is to say it was a dozen things happening simultaneously. Amber and rust and a deep bruised purple at the curved horizon where the thin atmosphere caught what light it could and held it briefly before letting go. The surface wasn't uniform. It moved with shadow and variation. It had texture. After 8 months of looking at the black and white and absolute stillness of deep space, the sight of a world with a surface, with geography, with things to look at, hit him somewhere between the rational mind entirely. And then there were the structures. Tema, Hargrove again. I'm going to need that confirm in the next 90 seconds or we're pushing the approach window. Copy that, Tema said. 90 seconds. He stayed at the window. Part 2. What the Robots Built. The establishment at Hellaspace had been under construction for 11 years before a human being set eyes on it in person. That was the part that kept circling back through Tema's mind as he looked down. 11 years of robotic construction, unwitnessed by any living eye. 11 years of autonomous systems waking each morning, if morning meant anything to a machine, and continuing work that had been mapped and planned and iterated on by engineers sitting in comfortable chairs on a planet 140 million miles away. No one had watched it happen in real time. Not really. The signal delay alone made live observation nearly useless. You sent instructions. Hours later, you received confirmation. You were always, in a meaningful sense, working in the past. And yet, the domes were the first thing that resolved into clarity as the Vega descended through its approaching arc. 3 of them, primary habitation structures, each large enough to hold a city block, their surfaces a semi-translucent composite that caught the Martian sunlight and gave back a faint, pearl-like sheen. They were connected by enclosed transit corridors that ran along the surface like pale veins. And at the junctions where corridors met, smaller secondary structures clustered. Equipment bays, he recognized, as atmospheric processing units, and what appeared to be the beginnings of a fourth dome still in its skeletal phase, ribs of structural carbon curving upward from the rust-colored ground like the bones of something emerging. Between the structures, things moved. This is what Tema had not yet been prepared for. The photographs never quite captured movement, or when they did, the scale was wrong, the context stripped away. But from here, at this angle, with Mars sped before him as a real place rather than an image, the movement of the robots had a quality that stopped his breath entirely. They were purposeful. There was no other word for it. Ground vehicles tracked between structures along paths worn smooth by repetition, hauling materials, transferring components, their movements unhurried and efficient in the way of things that do not get tired. Bipedal units, later generation construction models, he recognized the gait, moved across open ground carrying equipment, pausing occasionally in ways that almost looked like consultation. 2 units facing each other briefly before separating back to their tasks. Drilling platforms worked at the perimeter, their movements rhythmic and patient. A line of smaller autonomous units were laying surface paneling along what would become an exterior walkway, each one placing its section with a precision no human hand could match. It looked, from up here, astonishingly like a city in the middle of its morning. Not a human city. The scale was different. The silence was different, or what he imagined the silence was like. Here behind the viewport, with only the hum of the Vega systems around him. But the activity of it, the layered, simultaneous industry, the sense of a place that had its own rhythms and its own internal logic, that was unmistakably the quality of somewhere alive. Somewhere that had been waiting. Linkvist, Hargrove's voice had acquired a new note. Not quite concern, but something adjacent to it. The tone of a man deciding how much patience remains in his reserve. 90 seconds elapsed. I need you on the telemetry now. Tema finally turned from the window. His hands moved to the display's console with the practiced efficiency of 8 months of drilling, pulling up the port side alignment data, scanning the variance flag, cross-referencing against the approach vector. His mind did the work it had been trained to do. Variance is within acceptable range, he said. It's a sensor calibration artifact. The port housing ran cold during the transit phase and the expansion differential is reading as misalignment. It's not structural. Auto approach is a go. A pause, then, copy that, Tema. Thank you. A beat. Anything else to report from your end? Tema looked back at the window, at the domes catching Martian light, at the robots moving like a civilization that had been quietly, patiently getting on with things until the rest of us arrived. No, he said. Nothing else. Part 3. The Mathematics of Arrival. He had thought about this day for the most of his adult life. Growing up in Gothenburg, he had been the kind of child who tracked space missions the way other children tracked football scores, obsessively, emotionally, with a personal investment in outcomes that had nothing technically to do with him. His mother had found it charming. His father had found it baffling. His teachers had mostly found it useful. A child who would read anything, research anything, stay late for anything, as long as it had to do with the question of what was out there. He had been 12 when the first robotic missions to Mars began making serious structural progress, not just the proof of concept test structures of the early programs, but the genuine foundations of what would become Hellas Base. He had watched the compressed time-lapse footage of the initial dome frame going up with the particular intensity of a person who understands, at some pre-rational level, that what they are watching is part of the story of their own life. The application process for the first settlement cohort had taken 5 years. The training had taken 4 more. He had been rejected once, in the 3rd year, and the reason given, insufficient psychological resilience profile for extended isolation scenarios, had driven him back to work with a focus that impressed even the NASA psychologist who had written the rejection. It had been 29 when he was selected and confirmed. He was 38 now, 8 months into the transit, with the destination finally resolved from a bright point in the dark into a world with a surface and shadows and a sprawl of human-built structures tended by machines that had never known a human presence. He tried, sometimes, to hold the full weight of the number. 140 million miles from the closest other person who wasn't aboard the Vega with him. But the number was too large for the mind to really hold. It became abstract, like trying to feel the age of a star. What the mind could hold, and did, constantly, was a smaller and more devastating fact. That he had left. That the Earth was behind him now, a thing you looked back at through a window, blue and ordinary, and heartbreakingly small. His crewmates, Ifioma and Dr. Rashid, had both gone through their own versions of this reckoning in the early weeks of transit. Ifioma had been silent for 3 days, then fine. Rashid had written 17 pages in his journal that he later described as mostly useless but necessary. Tema had dealt with it by running calculations, orbital mechanics, approach vectors, atmospheric density modeling for Mars surface operations, mathematics as meditation. As long as the numbers were moving, something was going forward. Now they were here, and the numbers had become real. Part 4. What Ifioma said. Ifioma came to stand beside him at the viewport 20 minutes before final approach, when the Vega had dropped low enough that Hellas Base filled the window like a painting someone had been working on for a decade without an audience. She was quiet for a long time, then she said, "It doesn't look abandoned." "No," Tema agreed. "I thought it would look, I don't know, like a construction site, quiet, like something waiting for the people to arrive before it became real." She pressed her fingertips lightly against the viewport. "It already looks real." This was exactly the thing Tema had been trying to name for the past 2 hours. "The robots," he said. "The robots," she agreed. "They did this." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Below, a transport vehicle tracked between the 2nd and 3rd dome along the worn surface path, steady and unhurried, carrying something in its flatbed that caught the light. "Do you think they know we're coming?" Ifioma asked. It was a strange question, and she seemed to know it was strange as she asked it. There was a slight, self-conscious lift in her voice. "Not no, I don't mean it like that. I mean, will anything change when we land? Will they reconfigure? Will the routines shift?" "Some of them will," Tema said. "The ones designated for human support operations will come online fully. A lot of the construction units will stay on the current tasking." He paused. "But something will be different." "What?" He thought about it. Outside, the bipedal units were still moving between tasks and their patient, purposeful way, the base humming with 11 years of accumulated routine. "Someone will be watching," he said finally. "That's what changes. All of this has been happening without anyone watching. We'll be there. We'll see it." Ifioma nodded slowly, like a tree falling in a forest. "Something like that." Dr. Rashid's voice came through the intercom from the command deck. "Final approach, sequence initiating. You two should get strapped in." Neither of them moved for another 30 seconds. Just two people from Earth, pressed against a viewport, watching a world that had been quietly becoming itself without them, about to become something different now that they were here. Part 5. The First Footfall. The landing struts of the Vega touched Martian soil at 1432 local mission time, and for approximately 4 seconds the entire crew was silent in a way that had nothing to do with protocol. Then Hargrove's voice came through from Houston. 8 minutes delayed. 8 minutes was the one-way signal time today. The gap that had defined the entire mission. The unbridgeable reminder that they were genuinely, functionally alone out here. And he said, "Vega, we showed touchdown confirmed. Beautiful work. Welcome to Mars." They heard it 8 minutes after he had said it. By the time his voice reached them, they had already been sitting on Mars for longer than some people's commutes. This too was something the simulations had prepared them for intellectually, but not emotionally. The way the delay made Earth feel not just distant, but past, like receiving a letter from someone who, by the time you read it, has already moved on to other things. Tema was the third one out. Mission protocol dictated Ifioma first. She was the designated mission commander for surface operations. Then Rashid, then Tema. He had known this for years. He had made his peace with it years ago. Yet standing at the top of the egress ramp, watching the rust-colored ground come up to meet his boots for the first time, the ordinal position stopped mattering entirely. The suit muffled sound, of course. It muffled everything, reduced the world to what could be seen and what could be felt through the sole of boots and the pressure of a glove. But even through the suit, he could feel the particular quality of the Martian ground underfoot. Not soft, not quite hard, ancient. He looked up from his boots. The nearest dome was perhaps 400 meters away across open ground, its surface luminous in the afternoon light. Along the exterior, a group of construction units was working on surface paneling. The same work he had watched from orbit, now life-size, now present. The machines moving with their unhurled purpose, not 50 meters from where he stood. One of them stopped. He couldn't have said why that particular unit stopped, or whether it was coincidence. A tasking pause, a sensor reorientation, but it stopped, and the sensor cluster at the top of its chassis turned. and for a moment it was oriented in his direction. The sensor swept slowly, the way a face turns toward a sound. Then it turned back and resumed its work, laying the next surface panel with the same precise motion it had been executing for 11 years. Tema stood very still for a moment. Then he walked toward the dome. Tema stood very still for a moment. Then he started walking toward the dome. Beside him, inside the Vega, the radio crackled with Houston's ongoing commentary, telemetry, confirmations, suit pressure checks, requests for visual reports on the surface conditions. The voices of careful, distant people doing their necessary work. He loved them for it. He answered them when they needed answers. But with every step across the Martian ground, the dome drawing closer, and the robots moving in their quiet industry all around him, he felt something he had no name for in any of the three languages he spoke. Something that was not quite arrival, because arrival implied a destination that had been waiting passively for you to reach it. This was different. This was walking into something that had been becoming itself for 11 years, that had its own rhythms and its own logic and its own accumulated reality. And offering himself to it, not as a conqueror, not even as an explorer exactly, as a witness, as the first pair of real eyes. The dome's airlock was ahead of him now, 100 meters, the exterior light above it blinking in the patient automated sequence. It had been blinking for 11 years, waiting for someone to finally use it. Tema walked toward it under the pale Martian sky, and above him, the Vega gleamed on the surface like a new thing, and around him, the robots kept working, and somewhere in the rust-colored distance, a drill platform kept its slow, rhythmic movement as the whole vast patient enterprise of the place went on, as it always had, as it would now, with him in it, now with all of them in it, alive in the only way that mattered. It had been waiting. They were here.